Now, while the focus of this class will be on the development of complex human civilizations rather than on our evolution as a biological species, it does give us some good context to discuss the evolution of humans as a species. It helps us to understand, for example, the really small amount of time that we've been living in complex civilizations or states relative to how long we have been evolving as a species since our last common ancestor with the living great apes. So the next few chapters in the textbook will cover the evolution of the human species. One of the key things that will be helpful to understand this discussion is the chronology of major geological epochs. So this little table can just show you in a general sense what the epochs are, what they date to, and the epochs that we're going to spend the most time talking about in this class are really, initially we'll talk about the Pleistocene, during which we did most of our evolving, during which we actually evolved as an anatomically modern species, which dates from 2 million years ago to just about 10,000 years before the Common Era, or about 12,000 years ago. Basically, the end of the last ice age was the end of the Pleistocene. And then it's really during the Holocene epoch, in the last 12,000 years, that we have basically, across most of the world, developed sedentary societies, developed food production rather than just food collection or hunting and gathering, and during which we've developed cultural complexity. Now, some scholars think that we're currently in a new geological epoch, and this is an interesting discussion. The Anthropocene is a term used for, by most people, they mean since the Industrial Revolution, or essentially since the 19th century, that we now live in the Anthropocene. There are some archaeologists who've argued that the Anthropocene goes further back in time, maybe for the last few thousand years. And basically, Anthropocene, just like the word anthropology, this anthropos root word that it has in it means basically the time period of the humans. And there's some interesting justification for us living in the Anthropocene. For example, I've read that currently on the face of the earth, more sediment is moved by human intervention than by erosion, than by nature itself. So that's pretty compelling evidence that we might be in a new epoch. Again, some archaeologists have argued, in California, for example, Native American groups before the arrival of Europeans were doing things like managing fires and using fires to help manage the landscape and so forth. And so there have been some archaeologists who've argued that the Anthropocene goes further back than the Industrial Revolution. Some other terms that you'll want to know for this discussion of human biological evolution include hominid and hominin. Now, depending on what you're reading, the word hominid has been kind of more traditionally used, and it basically just means modern humans and our closest extinct relatives, so things that evolved into us, or our ancestors, things like Homo erectus and other related species like Neanderthals. Now, more recently, the word hominin has become really popular in biological anthropology, and this basically means our direct ancestors and other closely related species. So it's a very related term, and typically you'll see hominin when we're talking about the human sort of family tree itself. Now, just like we talked about with archaeological dating techniques in a previous lecture, we can use different scientific measures to understand what the environment was like during the evolution of our species. One of those is the study of carbon isotopes, or basically variants on the element carbon. We can get carbon isotopes from cores out of glaciers and ice cores. We can get carbon isotopes out of the exoskeletons of tiny little bugs in the sediment at the bottom of the ocean. And basically, over time, variants of carbon have have varied according to, for example, how much fresh water was trapped in polar ice caps. And so we can understand both global and regional environmental factors in the distant past by the study of these carbon isotopes. For example, to learn how high ocean levels were, or to learn how much grassland had taken over a region. So this helps to understand the sort of environmental context in which we evolved. Now, one of the basic underlying understandings of both this textbook and of the class itself is that humans have evolved both biologically and culturally. Though biological evolution, as proposed by Darwin, is still considered essentially a scientific theory, it's considered that in a technical sense, and it's the best, or one of the very best, demonstrated and studied theories in all of science. However, just because we do know that humans are closely related to living great apes, things like gorillas and chimpanzees, that doesn't mean that we absolutely understand the family lineage itself and how the current great apes are related in a chronological sense. For example, it's not clear. There are two different kinds of chimpanzees. There's Panpaniscus and there's Pantroglodytes. Panpaniscus, or the bonobo, is just as closely related to us as Pantroglodytes, the sort of typical chimpanzee that you would see like in a movie or something like that. They're both equally related to us because they, as species, actually split off from each other more recently than we split off from their ancestor. They behave in a really different way. Panpaniscus and Pantroglodytes have really different sort of internal politics and different behaviors, different gender dynamics. It's really interesting study that's really kind of off topic for our class. My point for bringing it up here is we don't know which of those two related subspecies of Pan is more like the ancestor that we shared with Pan, which is really interesting. So we don't understand everything about that ancestor. And biological anthropology, or the study of how we evolved and our bodies and so forth, and also paleoanthropology, the study of the evolution of humanity, is one of these fields of research where a new discovery can change everything. It won't change the idea that we evolved as a species, but a new fossil found next summer could totally rewrite certain details about the human family tree. So what you see on the screen here is a hypothetical model for how the living great apes, which you can see up at the top of the chart there, gorilla, Pan, Homo, Pongo, and then the lesser apes over on the right, how those are related. We know which are more closely related to us according to the percentage of our DNA that they share. We know that Pan is the most closely related to us. It's something like 98% or 99% the same DNA that we have. And so those things aren't going to change, but the understanding of how those species might be related to one another, and how many species there were in the human lineage, and how and when they broke off, is something that is going to keep changing. So stay tuned to that. So based on the fossils that have been found of hominin ancestors, and based on the paleoclimatic reconstructions that I discussed earlier, we understand that sort of the key development in our evolution that kind of made us different than the other primates was the development of bipedality. That means walking on 2 feet. It was thought 150 years ago that maybe humans developed a big brain first, and we sort of still kind of dragged our knuckles or walked on all fours, and that later we developed bipedality. But actually we found enough fossils now that we understand that we started walking on 2 feet when we still had a very ape-like brain. So from the neck up, our first biped ancestors looked a lot like a modern chimpanzee, but from the neck down, The reconstructions vary, and they were pretty small. They were only about 3.5 feet tall, and you see reconstructions where they look pretty hairy and so forth. But anatomically, in terms of the skeletal structure from the neck down, our ancestors have looked like us as bipeds for 6 to 8 million years. So there is a lot of debate about why bipedality is so important. People have suggested it has to do with the ability to carry things, to carry their young. Others have suggested that it has to do with the ability to stand up and look over the grass of the savanna and be able to spot both predators and potential food sources and so forth. And the fact is, we don't know. It would allow our ancestors to move around while carrying tools. And if you notice, we're not outfitted with the same kinds of sharp teeth and claws and armor and so forth that other species have. We're really kind of wimpy. We're not very well protected. We're not very well armed just in our bodies, but we do have wrists and elbows that allow us to throw things. We have grasping thumbs and hands that allow us to dexterously hold and use tools. And we have binocular vision with our eyes placed to the front of our skull that gives us depth perception that actually dates back even earlier into the primate line. These things sort of allow us to use tools, and tools are our kind of they're our weapon, they're our adaptation, they're our mode of survival. So that's another key factor in the development of in the evolution of humans biologically is the evidence that that our ancestors were moving on 2 feet and using tools. Now, another basic underlying concept in this class is that our ancestors evolved in Africa. This really isn't up for debate. All the evidence that we've found suggests that the first hominin ancestors that were diverging from the ancestors of the great apes came from Africa. Now, many of the fossil finds in Africa have been located in places like the Great Rift Valley, where you've got this exposed landscape with lots of erosion cut banks and visible stratigraphic layers and so forth, where fossils and stone tools are easy to see and eroding out of the hillside. So the Great Rift Valley in East Africa is a great example of that. There have also been some recent discoveries in South Africa. And this could potentially be slightly misleading. We know that clearly hominins were evolving in this part of the world, but they could have been evolving in other parts of Africa too, and they just aren't as well preserved. The topsoil in jungles, for example, is very acidic, and it would dissolve bone, and rather than preserving it as a fossil. And also just areas of the world that have a lot of plant cover on them can be really hard to investigate. So in part, our discoveries of fossil remains of our ancestors is driven by modern circumstances of what the landscape looks like in these different parts of Africa. And hopefully this will be a way for the study of our ancestry to keep developing as we get better techniques for understanding remains in different parts of the world. So just to reiterate, we were talking about bipedality. There are some different possible advantages bipedality would have given our ancestors and gives us today. We can see great distances, we can provide food to young, and we can provide for the elderly. We can bring home surplus resources to take care of our community. That makes us better scavengers. This is an interesting one, actually. Being a biped, walking on 2 feet, means that you have better locomotive efficiency. So for example, if you have a pet dog, your dog is probably faster than you are. If your dog saw a squirrel and got away from you in the park, your dog would probably outrun you. However, if you needed to hike for 10 miles and your dog joined you, your dog would probably get tired before you do. We may not be very fast, but we have great endurance and we can go long distances, and this could have been really important for our... Now, one of the ways in which scientists can identify that our ancestors were bipedal is actually with the hole at the base of the skull called the foramen magnum. I don't have a picture of it here, but essentially on a quadruped animal like your dog or cat or something, the hole in the skull where the spinal column and brainstem kind of connect to the skull is at the back of the skull, because that skull is kind of positioned at the front of the animal's body. On a biped like you and me, the head is kind of balanced, sort of like a pumpkin on a broomstick, at the top of the spinal column. That means that the hole in the base of the skull is shifted down toward the center. So we can actually identify in fossils of hominin ancestors which were bipeds. Another way that we can identify this is not even with human remains or hominin remains that are sometimes often incomplete, but also with preserved footprints. So for example, here's a famous instance at Lake Laetoli, where an ancient volcanic eruption deposited a lot of volcanic ash along the edge of this lake, and a pair of ancient hominin ancestors, either maybe a mated pair or an adult and a subadult or something, some family members, walked through this volcanic ash, and their footprints were actually preserved as fossils. So this is a famous example that's preserved today. So here we have a reconstruction of the different species dating back to between 6 and 8 million years, when we have a common ancestor with the living great apes that have exhibited bipedality. Bipedality identified somehow in their fossil remains, either through the study of their foramen magnum at the base of the skull, or through the shape of their pelvis, or through the angle of the femur. Something like that gives us evidence of bipedality. So we're still discovering species that show evidence for this. And one of the things that's happening is, as new species are discovered, if you notice at the lower left, there's Sahelanthropus chadensis, is a species that was discovered in Chad in Africa. We're discovering that species that exhibited bipedality seem to go right back to the divergence genetically from the last common ancestor with the living great apes. That really helps suggest that one of the things that makes us different, that started the hominin lineage, that sort of developed us as a new branch of evolution among the primates, was bipedality itself. In terms of understanding the early human ancestors, there have been some famous discoveries. Probably the most famous, and I believe discovered during a summer in which "Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds" by the Beatles was a really famous song playing on the radio a lot. The skeleton, the mostly complete skeleton of Lucy, an Australopithecus afarensis, dating 3.2 million years ago, was discovered in, I believe it was in the 60s. Now, one of the interesting things about Lucy is she has a mixture of traits. Look at her rib cage in that reconstruction in the middle. That's a much wider, kind of shallower rib cage than modern humans have. Similarly, her fingers, long and curved, her shoulders better for hanging from trees and so forth. She still has some features, especially in the skull and parts of the upper body, that are similar to the great apes. But her pelvis, the angle of her femurs, the thigh bone, the way her feet and ankles probably worked, those things are very much like modern humans. So Lucy is this interesting example of a remarkably complete skeleton. For a fossil, she really is quite complete, of a hominin ancestor with really great evidence of the development of bipedality. Now, dating about 1 million years after Lucy, is the emergence of a species that we've traditionally called Homo habilis. There's actually some debate over this name, which means in Latin basically the handyman or the handy human. This species is so named essentially because they are the first hominin species associated with stone tools. So they were traditionally thought to be kind of the emergence intellectually of human ancestors that still looked, in their stature, they're only about 3.5 feet tall. They still look like Lucy. They look like an Australopith, but they're called Homo, which is our our genus name, Homo sapiens. They're called Homo because they had these tools. They do have an increase in their brain case. If you look at that picture on the lower right, it seems like maybe they have a little bit more of the neocortex or the neofrontal cortex, the kind of the front of your brain for planning and so forth. But there's some problems with this model. One of the problems is that modern chimpanzees, use tools. They use tools like fishing sticks to get termites out of mounds and so forth. So it's very likely that our hominin ancestors, even before Homo habilis, were using some kinds of maybe tools that didn't preserve, things made out of wood and reed and so forth. But Homo habilis made the first stone tool technology, which has been called the Oldowan tool technology. Now, I'm going to show you this slide again in our next lecture because it'll be significant then too. But I want to show it to you now because it demonstrates that stone tools are really important. Archaeologists focus on the tools that our ancestors used in the past. That's really what kind of our bread and butter, what we focus on. So we can see with the development of Oldowan technology in Africa roughly 2 million years ago, that you can see in the upper left-hand corner of your slide there, we can see that first well-preserved stone tool or lithic technology used by hominin ancestors developing in Africa. That's one of the lines of evidence for our ancestors coming from Africa. And then later on, with other species like Homo erectus that we will talk about in the next lecture, we can see more sophisticated stone tools developing. We can see human behavior developing with better stone tools. And we can also see the stone tools as evidence of human migration, as the descendants of Homo habilis, as later hominins eventually leave Africa. So just to recap, we have good evidence and better evidence all the time for the evolution of modern Homo sapiens sapiens, you and me, that you can see on this slide in the upper left, out of a deep lineage of hominin ancestors emerging in Africa, sharing an ancestor with the living great apes like gorillas and chimpanzees and so forth, sometime between 6 and 8 million years ago. Now, some of the details, some of the individual species in that lineage are still, being discovered, but the basic overall picture is just coming into better focus.